Now, in a very quick history, you could say that in the beginning of this dual rise of capitalism/science, that it took a long time to get any traction on the real world. The questions being asked and the abilities that were being deployed were primitive enough that the ability of science to change the world was limited for a long time, a couple of centuries. But when the traction finally grabbed hold and enough was known, enough powers were put together, then there's that period in the 19th century where you can see a kind of euphoria of power, which would be, on the one hand, progress, conceived of as less suffering and more power over the natural world, but also conquest. Conquest of the rest of the people on the planet out of Europe, but also the conquest of nature, conceived explicitly as such, as a kind of a huge category error. At that point, the human to nature was often conceived of as master to slave. And so there were vast increases in public health and also in the physical power over the rest of the world, all increasing together to the moment of World War II, where I think the situation changed in this regard. The scientists won World War II. And so between penicillin, radar, and the atomic bomb, these guys in their white lab coats and their heavy black glasses sitting in their labs and speaking incomprehensible mathematical languages, and their English or their native human languages were as if second languages that they spoke poorly. These people suddenly had won a gigantic world conflict. And so, although the gun was to their head, the feeling, I think, by the civilian controlling powers of the time at Bretton Woods and directly in the post-war period, were it was unclear what these guys could do. That they could perhaps just disappear the gun to the head or cause the gun to fire in reverse. They looked like miracle workers. And so there was a need in the post-war period that science was regarded as dangerous as the military, and maybe more so, more dangerous than the military, so that like the military, it had to be under civilian control. And so when the war brought in gigantic federal support for basic research in a way that had never existed before, and under Vannevar Bush, this was transferred into a civilian program, the National Science Foundation. And a bill was sent by Congress up to Truman, who, at that point, the National Science Foundation was going to be somewhat like the National Academy of Sciences. Scientists were going to run it. And Truman and his advisors decided that was too dangerous, that essentially the National Science Foundation needed to be under civilian control, and the bill was vetoed by Truman, sent back, and then NSF was reorganized so that its leadership would be political leadership that would be appointed directly by the president. And at that point, Truman signed this bill. And from that point on, science has been regarded, I think, as a dangerous other like the military that needed to be under corporate civilian control. And at that point, a kind of social compact grew up between science and the rest of, particularly American society. Science as a kind of, as a sock puppet figure, you might say, says, fund us. Don't ask us any questions. Fund us. We will supply the necessities of life for you. We will supply the toys, but don't bother us. And so the semi-autonomy became a fuller autonomy and a disconnect between science doing its own thing, while the rest of the world said, well, that's fine. As long as we have the necessities and the toys, you can run your own programs. And so science had at that point more autonomy even than before, and a kind of moment of, this is the moment of hubris. The moment when you see DDT being sprayed in suburban streets because it was obviously the right thing to do, the sense that science had things figured out and was a depoliticized force on its own, and disconnected from politics at large, saying, well, that's your job. You can mess with the social world. We have our own program. Leave us to our research. And except for atomic issues, the scientists retreated to the labs and to the fields. And the atomic issues were different in a crucial sense, in that everybody could see that an atomic war would be bad. And so most of the scientific community said, we don't really need to speak against atomic war. It's obvious that it's bad. So we'll let the atomic scientists do this. So that the Institute of Atomic Scientists set up their bureau. They set up that clock that is always 5 minutes from midnight. The whole, the scientific community's sense that the atomic problem was being dealt with specifically by atomic scientists, and no one else had to worry about it. And besides, it was a self-evident danger. It was too stupid to happen, and so it wasn't going to happen. And it was, in fact, Goldwater saying dangerous things, saying, well, an atomic war wouldn't be that bad. So that caused the scientific community to gather up as a community and speak out in the election of '64 in favor of Lyndon Johnson. Not because they cared one way or another, except for that this Goldwater appeared to be a maniac and needed to be opposed. So this was one of the only political gestures by the scientific community in the post-war period. And yet, at the same time, in its own internal workings, the scientific community was having to deal with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. And the notion of human to nature equals master to slave was being replaced in the scientific community by the notion that human to nature was more like parasite to host, which is a very different relationship. And at that point, there were shifts going on which basically come down to the birth of the ecology movement, because parasites kill hosts all the time. An E. coli infection, for instance, is a parasite outbreak that can kill off its hosts. And in essence, parasites have to be good to their hosts if they want their own livelihood to continue. So this was an internal shift within the scientific community, and then there was an external shift as well. When Nixon was elected, he was convinced that the scientific community hated him, that scientists hated him, and this was only one of the many groups that he was convinced that hated him. But he kicked the National Science Foundation at that point was in the old executive buildings directly to the west of the White House, now called the Eisenhower buildings, but they're older than him. And he kicked the NSF out across the river into Arlington, Virginia, into the buildings where the NSF now so Nixon's revenge was a kind of a shock to the scientific community. And although it seems a little bit futile to think that physical proximity to the king figure was important, nevertheless, we are still primates where that kind of stuff does seem to matter, at least as symbolic gestures. So, I want to talk. I want to tell some stories about my own encounters with the National Science Foundation, which came then later in the mid-90s, when I was accepted into a program of the Antarctic Artists and Writers. The U.S. Antarctic program is run by the National Science Foundation, and in essence, NSF is the government of Antarctica, which is impressive, except for the continent is empty and frozen. So the NSF has control of an entire continent. It's just that it's Antarctica. So the artists and writers within the Antarctic Artists and Writers program are artists within NSF, and so this is one of these strange discipline or culture clashes where in order to send artists and writers down to Antarctica, there are applications like grant proposals, and the only way to evaluate them as far as the NSF is concerned is to evaluate them in the same way that they would evaluate grant proposals in the sciences. So they convene a panel at NSF, and they bring in experts in the field, and that would mean other artists and writers that had been there before, or some miscellaneous artists and writers that hopefully know something about the arts, and then some scientists who've been in Antarctica, so some Antarcticans, and they gather together a panel of about a dozen people, and for 2 or 3 days, they have to sift through a large but not huge number of applications and decide who gets awarded these grants. And so it's the same as the running of federal science and the way that federal money is distributed to the sciences, except in this case it's an arts program. And so it's pretty fun. Essentially, you get these proposals and you rate them 1 to 5. And 1 to 5 being a rather crude scale, then suddenly people are saying, well, I'll give it a 4.25 and a 4.5. It begins to divide down very, very quickly.